Welcome to A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. I'm your host, Tony Carnes. With us today, we have Brian Finnerty, our producer. Good to see you, Brian.
Good to see you, Tony.
You got back from a trip to the Holy Land. How was that trip, and what did you notice?
It was a really amazing thing. It was something organized by Opus Dei, which I'm part of. And for me to be able to be in some of the sites that Christ had been in, for example, we had Mass in the Holy Sepulchre where Christ was laying after he had died and where he rose from the dead. And to be right there where it happened, or to be looking on the walls of Jerusalem that Christ had looked on, it for me, it was really just an amazing experience.
Well, that is a tremendous experience that really everyone that should take advantage of. I didn't make it to the Holy Land, though I made it to the American Holy Land, to Texas this summer. Brian, one thing I noticed while I was traveling and speaking, that we have a number of fans out there. And they told me they were fans of A Journey Through NYC Religion Television.
And they're not all in New York City, right?
No. I talked to Eva and Tommy in a small town, rural town in Texas, and they said, "Oh, we watch you all the time," and they could list the programs. I was so surprised, and I was very gratified. They were probably, their interest is partly they're very devout Catholics, and that probably is one of the reasons they're interested and watch. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to a longtime supporter and watcher in Texas, Helen. Just a big hug for her, because she sees almost every program. Also, I'd like to say hello to Belazio Ministries in Africa, who has joined the Journey Circles and watches our program. And I'd like to also thank some long-term supporters here in New York. I'd like to thank Sheikh TA and also Rabbi Shlomo and his wife Adina. They have been, they're always giving good feedback. And also I'd like to thank Bill from one of our seminaries in Philadelphia, not here in New York, who responds all the time.
Say, Tony, how about the Philippines? They're probably as far away as you can get, because it's a 12-hour time zone difference. And there are a lot of devout Catholics, Christians over there. Do we have an audience in the Philippines?
Well, I haven't found that out yet, but you know what? We do have people from the Philippines that tune into the website. So, hey, a shout out to all people from the Philippines. Let us know if you're watching. In fact, if you have any comments or you just want to encourage us, email us or text message us. You can email us at editor@nycreligion.info, or you can Twitter message us or Facebook message us. We're always glad to hear from you. This summer, I had a really interesting experience with Ari, the Columbia J School, and the New York Times School. We went out for a day to look at religion in Flushing, Queens. And I met many people who are in the religious groups there who are our fans and who are always very helpful. I won't recognize them all by name because I'll probably forget some of them, and we'll recognize them in the future. Ari, of course, is always very astute. He's a very astute journalist, and always I learn from him as we go. Also,
I just say something. Ari has a really amazing reputation in the world of religion journalism. So he, of course, has a program at Columbia in religion and journalism. I just remember years ago being at the annual award ceremony for the Religion Newswriters Association. And seemed like everyone who's getting an award said, and I'd like to thank Ari Goldman, and I'd like to thank Ari Goldman who taught me, and I'd like to thank Ari Goldman. And finally, and then one guy, stood up and, as he was getting his award, said, and I'd like to thank Ari Goldman. Well, he was not my teacher, but everyone else is thanking him. So he just has an amazing role in terms of having educated a huge generation of journals covering religion.
Well, you're right. And I learned from him every time. By the way, Brian, he told me that I practice sympathetic objectivity, which is our brand of journalism. And in fact, I think he does. He shows a way of doing journalism that's not got you, not naive or Pollyannish, but a way that's sympathetic and empathetic, but objective at the same time. It's a hard balance to keep, and Ari certainly does it. There's another journalist locally, James, a photojournalist, who I recently had some conversations about religion, and he also always sets me straight to make sure we're on the straight and narrow for a sympathetic objectivity. Also, I like to give a shout out.
How did he set you straight? What do you mean? Was there a time that you did not abide by that creed?
No, it had to do with I was recommending some places that he could go photo shoot at, and I felt like I needed to make sure that I was giving him sort of an objective list of places, not just my own bias. And so just by talking to him, it was a big challenge that I would live up to that. And that's what I mean. Because when you're talking and interacting with somebody you respect so much, like Ari or James, that you just want to meet their standards, which is good for us. I'd also like to mention Pat and Robert, who have for 25 years operated the Christian Education Consortium, which is an all-day discussion they hold here in New York City. And this year, they asked a journey to lead the discussion. So one of the things we talked about, and I like to really say a hello to them and all the other members of the consortium. It was a absolutely sold out group, and every seat was filled. But what was interesting is we took up with the group a sort of a surprising revelation about changes going on in New York City, and also in exploring that, a mystery about how secularism has hit the city so much in our public spaces. And I think maybe that's what I would like to share, those two things today. One, a surprising demographic revelation. And then as we try to study that, a surprising revelation about, or a mystery about, why did the history of religion get sort of suppressed.
And this goes back to 1,000 years ago. It's pretty amazing, huh?
It is. I went out to, let me tell you what happened. I went out to Leif Erikson Park near Sunset Park and Bay Ridge to look at the history of religion of Norwegian Americans in the city. And at one time, there were several 100,000. Then they dwindled to, 6,000 or 8,000. But recently, in the last 20 years, 15 years really, they've all of a sudden popped up in numbers. And now there are over 25,000 Norwegian Americans in New York City. How did this happen? And what does it mean? And that's actually why I was there. If you look at a chart of the settlement of Norwegians in the census, we started looking at this in 2014 and repeated in 2019, and we also looked at the latest census data. What we discovered is the city is changing. It's becoming more white, more Asian, less African Americans, and Latinos are fracturing in between Latinos who identify on the white side as white Latinos, and Latinos that identify more as people of color. Now, for every 200, in a 5-year period, for every 200,000 whites that move into the city net, you get 100,000 African Americans move out, and about 75,000 Hispanic Americans move out, and about 100,000 Asian Americans move in. You see, these are big numbers. And the trend is continuing. Now, what is this going to mean for?
One thing is pretty extraordinary, isn't it? Because it's almost like exactly the opposite what we would all assume is the case.
Well, that's why you have a Journey Through NYC Religion. We don't just sort of replicate what everybody says is true. We sort of look for those surprising trends. And we've discovered in our 11 years of reporting a lot of the surprising trends. And one trend we picked up, started in 2014, we did an in-depth study, a demographic study, and we picked up that and predicted that it's likely that there would be more whites and less African Americans and more Asians. The increase in Asians is not quite so surprising in the city. And then we did replicate that in 2019 and said, you know, we're really seeing this accelerate. And then in the latest census with the data, which was released in the beginning of July, just, you know, a couple of weeks ago, what we find is that this trend is accelerating, and it's noticeable that, for example, in Bed-Stuy, the number of whites have increased several 100% over the last 10 years, several 100% in sort of one of the capitals of African Americans here in the city, Bed-Stuy.
So whites are in fact becoming a larger percentage in New York City, and that trend is accelerating right now.
That's right. And here's some of the implications that for religious groups. One is African American churches in Bedford Stuyvesant and other places are seeing their people are moving out, and they're asking themselves, how can we reach out to the new people that are moving in? After all, they reason this way. When you had the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020, in New York City, over 80%, 81% to be precise, of the demonstrators were either whites or Asian Americans, young, educated, progressive, fairly secular. The churches thought, well, we could reach out. The African American churches said, well, we could reach out to these people, and they're not having much luck. At Cornerstone Baptist Church, which is a terrific church headed by a very smart and wise and pastor, have tried to reach out and says, you could come meet at our church, or you could come to some of our events, and he's had no luck. Now, I think that one way we can help religious groups is saying, okay, we have these new demographic trends. How do we reach out to them? Let me give you an example of a success. The priest at Our Lady of Pompeii, I believe he's retired now, but Our Lady of Pompeii in the West Village told me, he says, Tony, you know, I became priest at Our Lady of Pompeii, and we had 35 people. I'm 82, and I was the youngest person there. He said, that didn't look good for the church. And he said, I mentioned this problem to the Italian consul, and he said, well, you know, there are 15 to 18,000 young Italians coming to New York every year to go into the financial services or one of the publishing industries or one of the design, you know, the high, you know, the professional area, or art or fashion design. He said, why don't you try to reach out to them? You see, when we start getting new groups, but how could he reach out to them with 35 fairly elderly people? He wasn't going to be able to reach out to them, but he hit on an interesting idea. He decided that he would try to convince the Vatican to send him some pieces of art from the Vatican Museum. He actually requested a Pietà. But anyway,
that would be a tough act to.
Oh, he was relentless. I tell you, this father was relentless in his ask.
You may as well throw in the Shroud of Turin as well, right?
That's right. He was relentless. He did get some pieces, and what he did is he said, "Come see." He sent out a mailer, said, "Come see art from the Vatican," and he found a young Italian artist who was here, who wanted to make some money to support ourselves. She said, I could teach art. And the priest said, well, why don't you teach art and do this? Come and learn how to paint like Michelangelo. So they have a gathering, 100 some odd people came out, young Italians, They wanted to mingle, they wanted to meet each other, boys and girls, all those types of things. And then they advertised this class, and the class filled up. They
That's
couldn't
very
add
true, but
anymore.
there's this, like, I mean, the church has always been the patron of the arts, and that's how it's catechized people and, you know, speaking through beauty, and this is sort of like a new example of that.
And it was successful. That church ended up having a couple of hundred young Italians coming to Mass. Now, this is happening all over the city. One is not in Cornerstone, they haven't been able to make the breakthrough, and we need to help them make that breakthrough. They're quick, they're smart, they really have incredible things to answer. Although right now, since they haven't made a breakthrough, they're thinking about moving their church, selling the church and moving, which would be, it's smart. They've got good management, so they look at the writing, but it would be really depressing if that happened. So I decided we need to look into this phenomenon a little bit more. And I picked the Norwegians because they're a small group. I thought we could really get a handle over a small group and see them as a thermometer of what's happening in New York, and also how might we reach them in some way for religion. And that's why I was out in Leif Erikson Park. And while I was there, I discovered a mystery. First of all, I didn't know much about Leif Erikson. I'm not Norwegian. And I wondered who Leif Erikson was. And the park says he was an adventurer, a Viking, you know. And so my image with him was, you know, the Viking with the club and raiding raiding and taking loot and captives and so forth. But I found out, and looking into it, I found out a mystery. I found out Leif Erikson was not your typical Viking. I bet most people don't know that Leif Erikson was a missionary, a Christian missionary. This is the story. And then why we forgot this, even Norwegians have forgotten this story to a large extent. Leif was sent by his father, Eric the Red, to join the court of the King of Norway. And the King of Norway became a Christian. And Leif Erikson became a Christian. Also, when the Vikings started to become Christians, the Pope told them, you cannot continue capturing and selling slaves. Oh, that's very contemporary. I thought, wow, I didn't know about this. Now, it wasn't a complete victory. It was don't capture Christians and sell them as slaves. But the Norwegians, the people they captured, were almost all Christians. So they weren't going and capturing non-Christians and selling as slaves, essentially. So it meant the end of their trade. In fact, the Vikings were known for going up and down the rivers of Eastern Europe, capturing Slavs and selling thousands of them to the Muslims and North Africans. And that's where we get the word slave from. They were the Slavs who were sold into captivity. That's the source of slave. They were white slaves. But when they became Christian, the Pope said, no, you can't do that. So the king told Eric, says, Eric, you need to go back and convert your father and to stop the slave trade. And Eric, Leif, knowing his father, who was a skull crusher and a raider, his father, in fact, was in exile from the Vikings because he had killed 2 Vikings in quarrels. But he was still a big shot and a big lord. And so the king said, you got to go back and convert him. And Leif Erikson said, that's going to be pretty hard. Why don't you go, king? I'm liable to go and I'm liable to get my head knocked in. No, the king said, no, you got to go, and I'm going to send priests with you, and because it was a Catholic church, and you're going to go. And so he goes and gets blown off course. Now here is starting to where our story gets interesting and affects New York. He gets blown off course to probably Newfoundland. And while in Newfoundland, they open a church. Now, how do we know this? We don't know it exactly. The story, the sagas of the Vikings does say that he came to the New World. Vinland, he called it. In 1961, an archaeology couple a man and woman, discovered a Viking settlement in Newfoundland. And in that settlement was a structure that looked like it's a church structure that's identical to a church structures built in Norway at this time. And furthermore, just last fall, a study was published in Nature magazine says we can date this settlement and we can date the date of the church. The date of the first church in North America was 1021. That's a pretty firm date. Now, possibly some of the timbers, these are timbers that were put late in the church. So maybe the church was founded a little bit earlier when they just started building it. Now, is this?
Would that have been the earliest European structure in the Americas?
Yes, that's right. And Leif Erikson, and we don't have Leif Erikson name on this settlement, but it seems to fit. It seems pretty plausible. It fits the church structures that were in Leif Erikson's time back in Norway and Finland, Norway and Scandinavia. So we're pretty certain this is probably for Leif Erikson. And furthermore, he goes back, does make it back to evangelize his father. His father says no, but his wife, his mother, becomes a Christian and builds the second church in North America, because Iceland and Greenland are technically in North America. So here's the thing, Leif Erikson Park doesn't say a word about this. It's all about the Viking, crusader and sailing adventurer and skull crusher. That's what the park is all about. Why? How did this happen? How come we forgot that Leif Erikson, the first church, was from Leif Erikson? Furthermore, Thor Heyerdahl, the guy who wrote Kon-Tiki about South Sea Islanders coming to America, also wrote a book about how Leif Erikson and his people sailed down the coast and actually founded a church, or a settlement, maybe not a church, a settlement in Long Island or on Manhattan. This is based on a obscure report that a priest wrote. I don't happen to believe this report. I think this is just something that the priest said, I'm doing such a great job, we're evangelizing all over the place, and we've made all these settlements. I don't think that happened. But it's very interesting, the possible alternative history of religion in New York may have started with the Viking religion. I don't, Christianity. I don't think that happened. But at any rate, in this park, it's nothing like that. In fact, what we get is the image of the Viking with the horns coming out, and conquering. In fact, the Vikings didn't wear horn helmets like that. That was not the Vikings. Where did that come from? Why do we have the Minnesota Vikings with horn helmets and all of this? And the Norwegians support that. Well, what happened was this. Norway was a state church, not popular because it was involved the state power. And you get two reactions. One, you get an evangelical revival, and they were put in jail. So a lot of them, almost all the Norwegians that came to America at that period in the 19th century, were evangelical Christians that were fleeing persecution of some sort. Then you also get the humanists who's saying, we don't want religion. And one of the people that helped them was a German opera writer, Richard Wagner. He said, you know what, the Vikings show us the alternative history of Europe, the non-Christian one. So he featured the Vikings and their pagan gods, and he added the horns. In order to have operatic presence on stage, he added the horns. And so ever since Wagner, we get horns on Vikings.
So true history is sort of like the exact opposite of the conventional wisdom right now.
And we know nothing about this, that the Viking, the two things, we don't know anything that Leif Erikson was a missionary. That's not in the park. We don't teach anything about this in our public schools. We don't teach that Leif Erikson Park is about celebrating a missionary to North America. We also don't recognize that the Norwegians that came here, the largest portion of them were Christians of some sort, and they founded all sorts of hospitals and churches and ambulance corps, and they were just sort of heroic in their activity that was very faith-based. We don't get any of that required in our New York State history. I looked over some of the New York State history tests that all students have to take. You know, they have to take these tests, students, to show how well are they doing in school. The world history test is not too bad. It has a lot on religion, but the American and particularly New York City questions only mention religion as when it's a problem. And there's not hardly any religion questions on there. The one year, the only question on religion in New York was the Protestants, and it had to do with the Protestants and Catholics fighting each other. You know, there's a historian at Yale that wrote a famous essay called The Jack in the Box of American history. And he says American historians tend to only want to put religion in when it pops up as a problem or is really weird. But in fact, they're around, I asked myself, in Leif Erikson Park, I see Chinese walking on the sunny day I was there. I see Hispanics talking with their kids. They're playing on the monkey bars, that's the Viking ship. And I said, how does this mean to them? Well, the answer actually is pretty clear. The churches, the former Norwegian churches all around the park, they're now filled with Chinese and Hispanic believers. They need to know that that park really belongs to them, and in common. We need to teach that. We need everybody in every part of the city to ask the question. In my neighborhood, when was the first church? When was the first masjid? When was the first Hebrew congregation? And what were the pastors and rabbis then? Which ones were heroic in their activity? What were the faith-based outwards? How did they help in disaster relief? In other words, the warp and woof of history in New York is filled with religion. We don't want any more Leif Erikson parks where we forget exactly who he is. That doesn't do anybody any good. So that's how come I ended up there. And I'm really glad just to share this with you. And we hope all our viewers will go back and look at their parks and their early history and figure out what were the religious monuments then. My name is Tony Carnes. I'm your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Goodbye.